let me introduce the president of the Hemingway Society, Carl Eby.
Great. Thanks so much, Suzanne. And welcome to Hemingway in Toronto. And thanks so much for joining us this evening. This is a terrific way to commemorate a really, really important centenary in Hemingway's life. This day, 100 years ago, in Toronto, Hemingway's first son, John, who we all know as Bumby, or in adulthood as Jack, right, was born. And so it's a terrific excuse to talk about Hemingway's important time in Toronto. Before we get started, though, I want to thank Suzanne and Sharon and the media committee for organizing this evening's presentation. You know, the media committee just does so much. I mean, the journal, the website, the newsletter, the blog, the social media, One True Podcast. So Suzanne, Kirk Kernett, Lisa Tyler, Tom Bevilacqua, Michael Von Cannon, big shout out and massive appreciation to all of you. I really appreciate what you all do. These webinars are a big part of that mission too. And this is part of our mission as the Hemingway Society, is to encourage interest and disseminate information about Ernest Hemingway. And this is a great way to do it. And it's a lot of fun. You can see I couldn't be in Toronto this evening. This is not actually Toronto behind me. I'm hovering about 1,000 feet above San Sebastian in Spain. But it's my chance to plug our conference. In next July 14th to 20th, we're going to be in San Sebastian and Bilbao, Spain, for our 20th International Hemingway Conference. And if you've been to one of these things, you know it's going to be pretty amazing. It really is. If you haven't been to one of these things, trust me, it's going to be seriously amazing. We have pretty wonderful conferences. So anyways, with all that said, it's now my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Sharon Hamilton. Sharon's a professional writer and researcher whose work appears in books like Hemingway in Comics and Teaching Hemingway in Modernism. She was also a guest for a special One True podcast episode on Hemingway in baseball. She's currently a member of the board of the International Hemingway Society, and you can follow Sharon at Life's Literary, and I think we're going to put that link in the chat right now, where she tweets about baseball and literature and jazz age cocktails. That sounds like fun. I could go for one of those now. Anyways, with no more ado, let me turn it over to you, Sharon, and thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Great, thank you for the lovely introduction. So I'll just share the screen so I can bring up my presentation for all of you. All right, now I'm assuming you can see that. That looks all right? Excellent. All right, we'll start. So as you heard, today we're going to be talking about Hemingway in Toronto on the 100th anniversary and of the birth of his son in that city in October 1923. So here you have the participants in this story, the key participants. As I said, there's going to be the son, who is going to be the third main member of my story today, but we also have Hemingway and his first wife, Hadley Richardson, and this is them on their wedding in Michigan on the 3rd of September, 1921. Keep Michigan in mind because it's going to play an important role later in the story that I have to tell you. Now, Hemingway and Hadley, after they got married in the fall of 1921, they lived briefly in Chicago. And after that, Sherwood Anderson suggested that if they really wanted to be where the literature was happening, they should move to Paris. And they did. And as many of you in this call will be aware, they became friends with the three people on this slide. Sylvia Beach, who owned the Shakespeare and Company bookstore, and a very important bookstore in the life of Ernest Hemingway. He learned a lot from the books that he borrowed from her. With the poet Ezra Pound, who was an important friend and mentor, and also the poet Gertrude Stein, again, an important friend and mentor. All three of these people are part of the story I have to tell for you tonight because Hemingway wrote to them when he was in Toronto. And so you'll find his letters to these individuals in volume 2 of the Letters Project, which I will be using extensively tonight. Very useful volume. So here's a picture of Shakespeare and Company today. Many of you, if you've toured Paris, will have probably been to this spot. It's not the original location of Shakespeare and Company. It's actually a second iteration of the bookstore, but it's very much in the spirit of the original and still a very popular tourist spot. And this is, in fact, a photograph from one of my own trips to Paris. All right, so diving into the meat of the story, here are Ernest and Hadley in Switzerland. They were there for a skiing holiday in 1922 and into January 1923. Here's a couple of slides of Ernest enjoying himself the way Ernest loves enjoying himself. He's having a carefree time of it outside, and you can see him. He's the last person on the slide. He's the one falling off on the end. So he's having a carefree time in Switzerland, really enjoying himself. There's a bit of conflict because this is the trip during which he discovers that Hadley is pregnant. And this is something that Hadley was very excited about, but Hemingway was less sure about being a father. Still, this was the situation. And in July of 1923, this is from a letter that Ernest Hemingway wrote to his friend Bill Horn. Bill Horn was a close enough friend that he was one of the groomsmen for Hemingway and Hadley's wedding, and also lived with Hemingway briefly when he was in Chicago. And so this is what he wrote to Bill. We're both crazy about having this young feller. I figure I've got to have a steady job during the first year of the baby, and then I'm cut out for romance rather than business. And I think that this final comment is quite telling. I mean, Hemingway understood himself that he really wasn't sure that he was going to make a great dad. He really liked having adventures and sledding down hills. And so there's some trepidation here about becoming a father. But he also realizes that there's some level of responsibility. And this is part of the story I have to tell you tonight as well. So Hemingway and Hadley find themselves on this ship. This is the SS Andania in August, headed for Canada. He writes to Ezra Pound, on the 17th of August, we sail on the Andania of the Cunards from Montreal, should arrive about the 27th, then go to Toronto. And this. So now, here's the question. Why Toronto? What was Hemingway's connection to the city? He knows that he wants to have a steady job for the first year of the baby. Why is he heading to Canada? For that story, we have to back up a bit. So I told you to remember Michigan. The Hemingway family had a summer cottage in Michigan. It's where Hemingway spent the summers of his childhood. And sometime there, he met the Connables. The Connable family were from Michigan and also had a summer home there. They were living, when Hemingway met them, in Toronto because Rolfe Connable Sr. was running the Woolworths chain of department stores in Canada. But he was an American, and they went back home to Michigan in the summers. And at some point, when Hemingway returned from his injury in the First World War as a Red Cross volunteer, at some point he met the Connables, and they offered him work. And the job was an interesting one. They invited him to become a house sitter for them in Toronto, and also to look after, be a companion for their son, Rolfe Jr. Rolfe had a bit of a minor physical disability, and the Connables thought that Hemingway would be a good example for him, that he could take him out and they could view sports and perhaps do sporting things together. The Connables also had another daughter, Dorothy, who will be in this story as well. And Rolfe's wife, Rolfe Connable Sr., his wife's name is Harriet. She also plays an important role in the story I have to tell. So all four Connables are part of Hemingway's life from this point on, from January 1920, when they invite Hemingway to house sit for them in Toronto. So this is a photograph of their home, the Connable Mansion. And this is still there at 153 Lyndhurst Avenue in Toronto. And this is a photograph I took of it last summer. So it looks very much the same now as it did when Hemingway was there. The inside has changed. It's been divided up into separate housing units, but the whole thing belonged to the Connables when Hemingway resided at this address. Now, while Hemingway was in Toronto, something extremely important happened. Rolfe Conable Sr., as an executive with Woolworths, had an important position vis-a-vis the Toronto Star because he was an important advertiser for the newspaper. And he promised Hemingway that he would speak to the editors of the Star to see if he could get Hemingway some writing experience on the newspaper. Hemingway was thrilled at this prospect, and in fact, it's probably one of the reasons he agreed to go to Toronto. And it looks like he started writing for the Star almost immediately when he arrived in the city. It's a little bit difficult to identify which stories are Hemingway's because, of course, when he's a cub reporter, he doesn't get a byline. But a lot of detective work has been done on the Toronto Star stories. Scholars have looked at the memoirs of the journalists he worked with, and they've looked at the style of the writing, and Hemingway's letters home, letters from his family and siblings, to see if they can piece together likely stories. Hemingway, this is one that was discovered relatively recently. There's a book by William Burrell on Hemingway in Toronto called Hemingway the Toronto Years, and he has this story in his appendix. Now, this is an important story because, relevant to our topic today, it looks like this could be the very first story that Hemingway wrote for the Star. And as you can see from what's on the slide, it was a medical story. So very early on in his time in Toronto, Hemingway is exposed to the fact that there are excellent doctors in this city. There are incredible medical innovations. And this is something he's going to keep in mind quite clearly when he has to decide what a good city is for his wife to have her baby. And in fact, this is confirmed from a letter that he wrote to Ezra Pound about going to Toronto. So this is a letter from September 1923 from Ernest Hemingway to Ezra Pound, in which Hemingway says, as you can see on the slide, "We have come to the right place to have a baby because that is the spécialité de ville," using some of his French. And it was, in fact, the city's specialty. And you can see this photo of Toronto in the 1920s. It's a very prosperous urban center, and it does, in fact, have excellent medical programs and facilities. So Hemingway and Hadley are coming to Canada. Now you know why. This is a place where Hemingway can get a steady job because he made that connection to the Toronto Star. And he kept that connection after 1920, that brief time when he was there with the Conables. He became a foreign correspondent for the Star when he was in Paris. And now his plan is to be a staff reporter for the Star in Toronto for the first year of Bumby's life. And so that's thing number one. This is a city that offers him a steady job. And then the other thing, as I mentioned, is they've got great medical facilities. So this is the place he wants to go. So this is them making the crossing. Unfortunately, it was a horrible crossing. And you can see again from the quote I have on the slide, he wrote to Ezra Pound that it blew a gale all the way. Poor Hadley, who was very pregnant, must have had an extremely bad time of it. He also told Pound, "If I'd obeyed the impulse to get off at Quebec and simply lived there until our money ran out, it would have been much better." And I don't know if the music played for you at the very beginning of this presentation while you were waiting, but the song was Hello Montreal, which is a song from the 1920s about the fact that you could go to Montreal for a drink. There was prohibition still in the United States at this time, and prohibition in much of Canada as well, but there was no prohibition in Montreal at the time. So Hemingway is undoubtedly right that he would have been quite happy in Montreal. Now, here's something interesting that happened at the same time. In the same letter to Ezra Pound, Hemingway said, "I go to work on Monday. The prince gets here on Tuesday." And here's the Prince of Wales, who was visiting Canada at exactly the same time as Hemingway arrived. And I'll pause here now and say, Suzanne, did you want to throw up the quiz that I have about this slide?
Can everyone see it? It looks like it's posted to me.
I can see it.
Perfect. Okay, we're getting responses.
All right. So you'll see the questions here. In 1923, Edward, the Prince of Wales, visited Canada at the same time as Ernest and Hadley were arriving in the country. Edward later became King Edward VIII, a British monarch now mainly famous for A, being the father of the future Queen Elizabeth II, B, abdicating to marry Wallis Simpson, C, being King of Great Britain during World War II, and D, relinquishing the title Emperor of India. And I will I don't know when Suzanne sees the tally of the votes, but I'm going to move on to the next slide while you are voting on that, if I can.
Yeah,
Well, I
no,
don't know if
that's
I can.
okay. Certainly feel free to move on to the next slide, but it's a poll, Sharon. So far we have 16 out of 17 people voting, and they are voting for abdicating to marry Wallace Simpson. So if you
That
want
is
to go to the next slide,
that
I
is
can end.
exactly right.
Okay, I'll
It's
end the
not
poll.
letting me do that, so I think you have to end the poll. It looks like we can't do it concurrently. There we go.
And go ahead.
Oh, all right, there we go. There we go. All right, so and they were right. Thank you for voting in our poll. So yes, he was famous not so much for his time as Prince of Wales as for what came after. But at the time, he was a very popular figure and a very handsome, dashing figure. He inspired a lot of fashion. And in Canada, he inspired a change in that year of the money. So Hemingway refers in his letters colloquially to seeds, and he'll talk about having some seeds. That year, when he was in Canada with Hadley in 1923, some of those seeds that he might have had in his pocket would have looked like this. They made a new bill with Edward the Prince of Wales on it. So here's where Hemingway went to work. This is the old Toronto Star building on King Street West. It's no longer there, but this is the building in which Hemingway worked. He thought when he was here that he would be working for John Bone, who was the Toronto Star's managing editor, who had been his editor when he was working as a foreign correspondent in Paris. But it turned out that he did not end up working for Bone at the Star. He ended up instead under someone named Harry Hindmarsh. And this was not a good pairing. Hindmarsh was fairly clearly insecure about his own abilities as a newspaper man. And that may have been compounded by the fact that he had his job, most likely, because he was married to the publisher's daughter. So there was definitely nepotism involved in his position. He, at any rate, took a dislike to Hemingway and treated him horribly the whole time he was in Canada. So you're going to hear more about Harry Hindmarsh and the very bad relationship he had with Ernest Hemingway. So this is where Hemingway and Hadley moved when they first arrived in Toronto. This is the Selby Hotel. At the time, around 1920, a historic photo of the building. And this is how it looks today. And again, I took these pictures last year, so you can see that it looks very much the same. If you want to go, you can see it. It's at 592 Sherbourne Street in Toronto. This is the inside of the building. You can see it's just absolutely gorgeous. They've done a great job of renovating it. And you'll see that Hemingway has not been forgotten. If you'll see at the top of the menu on the slide, they refer to Eggs Hemingway. If you go for brunch on the weekend, you can in fact have a Hemingway-inspired meal. And Eggs Hemingway includes poached eggs, smoked salmon, spinach, croissant, and sauce béarnaise. And I can attest that it is quite excellent. I had that myself last year when I was in Toronto. So here's one of the things Hemingway obviously did not like about Toronto. I mentioned that in Montreal they had no prohibition, but in Toronto they certainly did. And he complained to Ezra Pound that he had not had a drink for 5 days in one of his letters to Pound. So not happy with that part of life in the city. Shortly after Hemingway arrived, he was sent on a very exciting assignment. He was sent to write an article about a prison break that had just happened in Kingston, which is still a city which has penitentiaries in it. It was a huge story, and you can see that it got front page play on the Toronto Star, but Hemingway was not given a byline. And this is, again, an indication of the bad relationship he had with his manager, Harry Hindmarsh. Hadley often wrote people about what a hard time Hemingway was having in Toronto, how hard he was working and how badly he was treated. To Hemingway's parents, she wrote, "So many trips, no sleep, and countless unimportant assignments." And to a friend, she wrote, "Our hearts are heavy, heavy, just when we ought to be happy." This is where the Hemingways lived. This is their Toronto apartment, and it's still there. These are photographs, again, that I took recently. It's at 1599 Bathurst Street, and this is very close to where the Constables lived. So you can imagine this is a location that they would have picked partly because it was close to people that they knew in the city and with whom they got along very well. Hemingway liked the apartment itself. He wrote about it to Ezra Pound. "The view from the window is very fine." And to his sister, he wrote, "We have a very lovely place here, just on the edge of the country, across a ravine from the Hunt Club. It is all very beautiful, new, light, airy, beautifully and tastefully furnished by ourselves, full of electric fixtures and bathtubs." Here's the plaque that's on the front of the apartment house. And so you can see that when you're in Toronto now. Here's something that Hemingway loved about Toronto. He didn't like the lack of alcohol, and he wasn't having a good time at his work, but he loved the fact that they had horse racing. And in fact, he wrote a poem called "I Like Canadians," in which he refers to the fact that in Chicago, they made fun of people in Toronto and they called them Puritans. But he said in Toronto, you can go to the races, you can go to boxing matches, and both of those things are illegal in Chicago. So he thought that the Canadians were ahead on that one. Hemingway won at the track at least once when he was in Canada, and he wrote Ezra Pound a letter about it. He told Ezra Pound that he had won, appropriately enough, in September 1923 by betting on Baby Mine. So there you go. There's something in line with the theme of tonight. He's thinking about being a new father, and he had luck at the races with that name. He also bet on a horse called My Dear. He won $32.50 on Baby Mine and $10.50 on My Dear. And he said to Pound that actually this depressed him a little bit because the $40 he won at the races was more than he made in 2 weeks of working for the Toronto Star and under very bad conditions. So he loved the races, but sad about the reminder of his terrible job situation. So now we're moving close to the anniversary of what happened on October 10th today. On October 9th, 1923, Hadley was having dinner by herself with the Constables. Hemingway was not there. He had been sent out of town to New York on assignment for the Star. You could probably guess what's going to happen next. Hadley starts to feel uncomfortable after dinner and in pain, and Harriet Constable is the one who drives her to the hospital. Hadley said that they arrived just in time. They went to Wellesley Hospital. Again, this is no longer there in Toronto, but this is a historic photo, so you can see what it looked like. While Hadley is at the hospital, Hemingway was on a train making his way back from New York. He had been sent to New York to report on the visit there of David Lloyd George, who you see on the slide, who was a former British Prime Minister. So this really annoyed Hemingway, understandably. He was worried about the fact that Hadley might go into labor when he was gone. His father was an obstetrician, so he knew that things could go very badly for the mother and for the child during childbirth, and was obviously very concerned about that. And here he'd been sent on what was really a nothing story. This wasn't the current British Prime Minister visiting New York, it was the former British Prime Minister. Hemingway is still on the train making his way back to Toronto when Hadley gives birth. So at 2 in the morning on October 10th, 1923, John Hadley Nicanor Hemingway was born. The name Nicanor most likely comes from Nicanor Villata, the matador. So there are happy memories of Spain in the name, and this is the birth certificate is on the slide. Hadley wrote into a letter to a friend, he's a corker of a baby boy, which I thought was just a lovely description of John. Hemingway made it back to town, threw his story to a Toronto Star reporter who was waiting for him at the train, ran to the hospital. And then later he wrote Ezra Pound about how he reacted next time he was in the office and he saw Hindmarsh. So in his letter to Pound, he says, 2 o'clock in the morning, heard about it 10 miles out of Toronto and came in intending to kill city editor Hindmarsh. Compromised by telling him would never forgive him, of course, and that all work done by me from now on would be with the most utter contempt and hatred for him. Also, offered knockdown if editor's trap opened. Consequently, position at office, highly insecure. So there's Bumby. As you could see, he really was a corker of a baby boy. It's a beautiful photograph of him and his father. I love this telegram that Hemingway sent to Sylvia Beach the next day. 7-pound boy, 3 hours, all Jake. And all Jake just being a slang term from the 1920s to say that everything is just fine. He ended up being nicknamed Bumby because, according to Hadley, he felt sort of like a teddy bear in their arms, and the word Bumby made them think of the round, solid feel of him when they were holding him. So here's an interesting fact, though, about Hemingway and Hadley and the hospital. In another letter to Ezra Pound, Hemingway says, "On Sunday, when I wanted to take a box of chocolate peppermints to Hadley in the hospital, I had to buy them from the bootleggers. The drug stores cannot sell candy on Sunday." I know that the Sunday shopping laws are a real thing. He's definitely referring to something that happened. I do not know whether the chocolate bootleggers are a real thing, and I would love to know if they are. So if anyone has done any historical research on Toronto, I really would like to find out if you could buy bootleg chocolate outside the hospital. Not long after Bumby was born, a very important thing happened professionally for Ernest Hemingway, in that he had 2 articles about bullfighting published in the Toronto Star. They were big articles. They're given a really splashy heading in the Star, and it's his first published writing about bullfighting. And of course, this is very important for Hemingway in his career. He's going to write about bullfighting in Dangerous Summer and also in The Sun Also Rises. And this is really where he gets his start in the coverage that he got from the Star. And he wrote his father about the fact that he had 2 quite interesting articles on bullfighting published, and he was quite proud of the fact. And this is where I was going to ask for the second quiz. So if you want to pull that up, Suzanne, because it's about the next story that I'm going to tell you about in the Star that fall.
Yep, give me 1 second. I just have to get rid of this quiz. And try the second one. Here we go. You are ready now.
There we go. All right. So the next quiz is about the next story I'm going to tell you about that Hemingway did that fall. So this one is about Dr. Frederick Banting, who Hemingway interviewed in 1923 in the fall. Banting was famous in the fall already by the fall of 1923 for A, having discovered a serum to combat pernicious anemia, B, discovered penicillin, C, discovered insulin, or D, discovered a treatment for epilepsy. We'll give you a moment to vote on that.
Just let me know when you'd like me to share the results with
Go ahead.
audience. Okay.
Sure.
There we go.
Excellent. It was, in fact, insulin. 1921, he was a co-discoverer of insulin, and in fact won a Nobel Prize for it in 1923. So, great guesses. All right. Now I will hopefully go to the next slide if you've stopped that.
It should move, yeah.
There we go. All right. So, yes, here you go. So Hemingway, when he interviewed Dr. Banting, as I said, is already a famous scientist because of the discovery of insulin in 1921. And essentially, Hemingway's interview with him in the fall of 1923 was to combat fake news. So this is nothing new. There had been a story circulating that Banting had come up with a serum to combat pernicious anemia, and this was not true. So the quote on the slide is Hemingway combating the fake news to say that it's not true, and pointing out this is just recent that Banting had won the Nobel Prize. So he had some great stories when he was in Canada. He covered some very important things. He was able to publish his articles on bullfighting. He was able to interview Dr. Banting, which was a huge story, covered the jailbreak in Kingston. But his experience of working under Hindmarsh was really, really horrible for him, and was really breaking his spirit. And this is from a letter that he wrote to Sylvia Beach in November 1923. We are still as fond of each other as ever, and the baby is a good article. We are the only nice people in Canada. So really feeling very discouraged, and this leads to the ultimate decision that even though he had wanted to stay for an entire year to support the baby during the first year of life, he just couldn't do it. And this is his letter of resignation to the editor that he liked working for. Mr. Bone, I regret very much the necessity of tendering my resignation from the local staff of the Star. This resignation to take effect January 1st, 1924, if convenient to you. Please believe there is no rudeness implied through the brevity of this memorandum. Ernest. And that's from December 1923. So this is in effect the end of Hemingway's time in Toronto. Not very long. He's going to leave. He and Hadley sail back to Paris in 1924 in January. But just to take a few minutes to talk about the legacy of that time, although brief, there were some important things that happened while he was in Toronto. I've mentioned that he did do some very important journalism, both his foreign correspondence journalism and also his journalism while he was in the city. Of course, Bumby is born in Toronto, and so there is a Canadian connection through his child. But I wanted to talk a little bit about something else, which is the development of his craft in other ways. Hemingway had to commute when he was in Toronto, just in the same way that many people commute there today, obviously, to go to work. It's a big city. And there were trams, there were streetcars at the time. This is a photograph from streetcar tracks in 1923 when Hemingway lived in the city. And there still are. You can take the streetcars today that Hemingway would have been on, or at least the same sort of routes. While he was on the streetcars commuting to work, he thought about story ideas. And he wrote Edward O'Brien about this. This is one of his publishers. In the morning, a story started in your head on the streetcar and have to choke it off because it was coming so perfectly and easily and clear and right. You know that if you let it go on, it will be finished and gone, that you'd never be able to write it. So Hemingway says to O'Brien that he had to let the story ideas go. But is that entirely true? He had all that time to think while he was commuting on the streetcars, and he definitely was getting story ideas. What happened with those? Well, we have some interesting evidence about what was going on. And one of the things that we have is on the back of a letter to this individual. Lawrence Larry Gaines was a Toronto-born boxer, and he befriended Hemingway in Paris. And Hemingway actually wrote about him. You can read it in the story, A Strange Fight Club, in the restored edition of A Movable Feast, not the original version, but if you read the restored edition, A Strange Fight Club is actually a story that involves Gaines. And as I say, he befriended Gaines when they were in Toronto. And on the back of an unsent letter to Gaines from November 1923 is the earliest known manuscript of Indian Camp. So many people would say that this story obviously is just one of Hemingway's masterpieces, and would identify this with the beginnings of his mature style. So his mature style is beginning here while he's in Toronto. Even if he is miserable, he is having story ideas, and he's starting to write his stories very, very well. And when he gets back to Paris, there's an absolute outpouring of talent and creativity. So again, I think all that time thinking about story ideas on the streetcars. Scott Donaldson in The Paris Husband talks about the period from February to April 1924 in his text, and he describes this period as when Hemingway was writing at the absolute top of his form. In those months, Hemingway wrote 8 stories that would appear in our time when it was published in 1925. Indian Camp, The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, The End of Something, The 3-Day Blow, Soldier's Home, Mr. and Mrs. Eliot, Cat in the Rain, and cross-country snow. And of course, those of you on this call who are familiar with the short stories will also know that babies or birth or something to do with children is a sub-theme in several of those stories, including the suspected sub-theme of Cat in the Rain, where the wife says, I want a cat now, and the husband doesn't really want a cat. And many people think that there's symbolism there for having a child. So there's a ton of creativity going on right after he gets out of Toronto. As soon as he no longer has all that work draining his time, those ideas that he thought of on the streetcars when he was commuting, he manages to set them down, and also to get out those emotions that he was going through as a new father. And I want to end with one final thought about Hemingway's relationship to Toronto. At the time when he was writing letters about Toronto in 1923, to Gertrude Stein, to Ezra Pound, to Sylvia Beach, he was fairly negative because the experience was fairly negative at the time. But in retrospect, did he feel the same way about Toronto? At the end of his, near the end of his life and near the end of his career, in 1953, when he was living in Cuba, he received a letter from Dorothy Conable. So you remember the Conables had two children, a boy and a girl, Ralph and Dorothy. And Dorothy wrote Hemingway about the fact that she had really enjoyed Old Man in the Sea. And Hemingway wrote her back. Hemingway wrote, "We had such a fine time in Toronto, and I loved and admired your lovely mother so much, and learned from your father, and liked Ralph, and was useless to him. Bumby is an instructor in a special intelligence course at Fort Bragg, and is a captain, but having superior efficiency reports. He did very well in the war and was the only person I ever knew to parachute into occupied France with his fly rod," which is, according to Bumby, a true story. If you read Memoirs of a Fly Fisherman, Jack records that story in that book. Hemingway also wrote this to Dorothy. "Thank you for liking Old Man in the Sea. I had a lot of luck writing it. Ever since your letter came, I felt this wonderful dry cold of the Toronto winter, and how nice you were to someone as stupid as me, and how much fun it used to be to talk in your lovely room." And he says, "I would like to write about Toronto sometime, instead of having Mr. Fenton do it." That was a biographer who was writing about Hemingway at the time. "This letter is stupid, but I was very moved to hear from you, more than I thought I ever could be about almost anything. Good, fine, lovely, beautiful Dorothy. Please skate once for me." So in the end, the memories of Toronto, at least as he expressed them to Dorothy, were quite positive. And I want to end on that note. And I believe we've got time for questions and answers. Thank you.
Sharon, thank you so much for that. And I want to thank everybody for bearing with us as we got started. Sharon's talk was certainly worth it. I can see all the applause floating up on my screen. I think we can start with the questions in the chat, and everyone feel free to add additional questions. But and then after that, I think we should give everybody a taste of the Hello Montreal song, because it's become clear to me that the opening sequence didn't work as planned. So, but the first question is, so from Karen Doucette, why did Hemingway write so many newsy letters to Pound during this time, Sharon?
Why did he write so many newsy letters to Pound? And by the way, this is coming from someone who would have reason to know something about Toronto. They were good friends, and Pound wrote fantastic letters back. Pound was really funny, and he referred in his letters, instead of calling Toronto Canada, he referred to it as Tomato Can. Hemingway enjoyed, and it became a joke actually at the Star. So Hemingway obviously shared it with his fellow reporters that Ezra Pound called the city Tomato Can. And so I think it just cheered him up a lot to receive the letters that Pound wrote back, especially when he was going through such a hard time. And he could also be very honest with Pound. He wouldn't write his parents or necessarily some of his stateside friends about not being able to find drinks, but Ezra Pound was still in Paris and could definitely relate to how hard that would have been for Hemingway. So, but I think the main thing is it cheered him up. And there's a great book. Someone has written about the friendship between Hemingway and Pound. I forget the title now, but anyway, The Dangerous Friendship or something like that. But there's a really, really good book, a touching book about the friendship between the two of them. And I definitely recommend it. But I think that that's the reason. Pound was super funny, and it would have cheered him up a great deal.
Great. We also have a question, Sharon, about is the place where the Constables mansion, where Ernest stayed, is that preserved as it was in the time?
I didn't. You were at it just garbled at the end there.
Yeah, is the Constables? I'm sorry.
It was not
Yeah.
been.
Oops. Can you hear me?
The question was, is the place the so I would say
yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I just scrolled down to see the question because I couldn't hear the end of what you said, Suzanne. No problem. Not as far as I know. That that is a private residence, and people live there who would probably prefer not to have Hemingway people knocking on the door. And I don't believe there's a historic plaque on that building either, in the same way that there is on the Hemingway apartment where he and Hadley lived on Bathurst Street. So I think the answer is no, but that's a very good question. And in fact, this is something that I should definitely try sometime, knocking on the door and see what happens. And so much renovation has happened, and the inside still looks the way it did when he was there. It's amazing how similar the outside looks, almost identical to how it was at the time.
Okay, wonderful. Can you hear me now, Sharon? I just want to make sure. I've been having trouble. Great. Okay. So Steve says, wonderful presentation. Thank you. Do you have any comment on the relationship with Callahan? Was that interaction earlier or later? And I'm guessing Maury Callahan?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, Steve. Morley Callahan, I didn't talk about that in the presentation. Morley Callahan was a cub reporter at the Star when Hemingway was there in 1923, and he served as a mentor for him. So they did meet at the time, and Hemingway encouraged Callahan in his writing. Callahan, especially those who are on this call who are Canadian, will probably recognize the name because Callahan became a novelist and a very great one in his own right. And Callahan admired Hemingway enough that in the end of the 20s, in 1929, he went to Paris and he hung out with Hemingway in Paris, and he wrote a fantastic memoir about it called That Summer in Paris. So I recommend reading that if you're interested in the Hemingway Callahan relationship. Again, there are maybe people on this call who know that the most famous Hemingway Callahan story is about Callahan knocking Hemingway out, and Hemingway blamed F. Scott Fitzgerald. He said Fitzgerald was drunk and hadn't been a proper timekeeper, and it was all Fitzgerald's fault. But there's famous that he knocked Hemingway out. Handles this in That Summer in Paris and gives his verb events.
Wonderful. Sharon, I was going to share the two links that you shared with me in advance. Do you want to explain what people are seeing? The first one is connected to the Toronto Public Library.
Yes, so I spoke last week at the Toronto Public Library on Hemingway's time in Toronto as a part of a live talk. It was not streamed or recorded, but it was another commemoration of this important 100th anniversary in Hemingway's life. And the Toronto Public Library prepared a lovely blog post to accompany my talk, and it's got some great archival photographs that they pulled up from their own digital archives of Toronto in 1923 when Hemingway was there. So I really encourage you to read the blog that Suzanne's putting the link in the chat for you. It's a really nice overview of Hemingway's time in Toronto.
No, not yet. Give me a second. Okay, here we go. So another question that we have is from Chris Daly. He said, how did Hem's time at the Toronto Star compare to his time at the Kansas City Star?
Well, people talk about the Kansas City Star being so important because of the list of rules, you know, the for how to write being so important. But he wasn't really at the Kansas City Star very long. And of course, he really was a cub reporter. It was his first real job, really, other than farm when he went to the Star. So experience Toronto, sending them stories still in 1921 when he was back in Chicago. Then he's working as a foreign correspondent when he's living in Paris, and he covered some very important events. And the Scott Donaldson book I mentioned, The Paris Husband, covers the reporting in depth when, as Hemingway was a foreign correspondent, does a fantastic overview of those stories.
At this point, Sharon, any final thoughts or anything else you'd like me to share for you?
Well, I think you said you're going to play Hello Montreal for them.
I am.
If you can, lovely way to end. This is a great jazz song from 1928, so it's after Hemingway's time in Canada, but he would have heard similar kinds of jazz music. It's from the 1920s, so it's a similar style to what he would have heard, and he would have loved these lyrics. They celebrate the fact that you can go to Montreal and just party. You can drink. They talk about making whoopee night and day. There's even the sound of glasses clinking at one point in the song. It's a great party song, and so it's too bad Hemingway wasn't able to stay in Quebec instead of having to go to Toronto as he did, because I think Quebec, in fact, would have suited him quite a bit better.
I'm leaving town, I'm going right away. Everything up there's okay. Take it easy, we've got a hunch. You won't go so easy, you won't go well. We'll all go in a bunch. It'll be leaving in the summer, and we won't come back till fall. Goodbye, Broadway, hello, Montreal. There'll be no more orange phosphate, you can bet your Ingersoll. Goodbye, Broadway, hello, Montreal. We're away, we're on our way, and we'll make whoopie night and day. There'll be photographs of breweries all around our bedroom walls. Goodbye, Broadway, hello, Montreal. Oh, we won't get home until morning. Goodbye, Broadway. Put a sign on the table. Everybody's in a hurry, coming for the ride. Nobody knows how dry I am. Sweet Adeline. Yes, the weed off the door. Get the weed left the car. Goodbye, Broadway. Hello, Montreal.